Hi, I'm Gemma Lauren Krebs, author of the Locked series, here to read you the next chapter of my first book, Nothing Lost. You can follow me at Gemma Lauren Krebs and at the Locked series, and you can purchase Nothing Lost on Amazon.com if you're interested, or just listen to me read it to you. Hope you guys are having a good day. Let's get into Chapter 9, The Garden. Jevin and I met at the entrance to the garden tunnel at mid-morning. The green of our apprentice robes shone starkly in the dim lighting of the palace. "Ready?" I asked, smiling. Jevin nodded avidly, but there was a small wrinkle between his brows. "You've been doing quite well with your training. I'm sure it will be fine." "Thanks, Shay." He let out a breath. "Ready." I tilted my head toward the hidden break in the wall. "Let's go." We sidled through the narrow walkway leading to the tunnel. Firelight flickered warmly, the lamps already lit for the day. We met my father before the line of sunlight dividing the tunnel. It cast a faint glow around him as he stood. We bowed to him, and he nodded back, one cord of hair coming loose to his shoulder. "Good morning, Master," I said. "Shaylight, Jevin," he greeted us, eyes resting on Jevin, then turned to me. "You have been training him? How has he taken to the ways of the garden?" I had worked all morning on how to present the information to my father. He didn't like to waste time. "Very well, Master. He was able to put out the candle and has done so every day within a few attempts after he first achieved it on his second day of training. He is doing well with meditation and is making progress using the mindset in his meditation. Yesterday, I took him to the upper gardens to assess his skill with plants. We have gotten through 8 of the 25 chapters of the small handbook, and he has memorized nearly all of that. I believe he is well on his way to becoming a fine apprentice." Jevin shuffled his feet. I doubted he was used to being assessed so resolutely. "Good. Jevin, how do you feel your training is going? Are you getting to a point where you can commune and understand the plant life around you?" Jevin clenched a fist. "I believe I have gotten glimpses of what it means to communicate with the plants. I've been able to extend the mindset that puts out the candle and practice often." My father seemed to retreat into thought. "Very well. Neither of you have taken your duties lightly." He stepped back. I saw his shoes were already removed. "The Queen has asked me to allow you to enter the garden as soon as possible. I was hesitant, as typically we wait 10 years before letting an apprentice enter the garden. However, this circumstance is quite different. In just 2 years, you will need to be working full-time in the garden alongside me." I held my breath, waiting for the decision. "It seems to me that you are even further along in your studies than I could have hoped. At this rate, I believe you will be able to learn the rest quite quickly. The most important part of the training, besides the beginning mindset, is caring for the great tree. You must learn about her, how to protect the tree and the plants that surround her." Jevin nodded, seeming a little dazed. "Therefore," continued my father, shoulders dropping the smallest amount, "I want you to enter the garden tomorrow." Neither Jevin nor I said anything. My mind went blank for the slightest second. Tomorrow? Truly? "Shaylight," I shook myself mentally, striving to pay attention. "I know you haven't gotten to the procedures to enter the garden, so I expect you to go over those with Jevin for the rest of the day. Make sure he can apply the face paint himself and instruct him as to what the symbols mean. I want both of you here tomorrow at mid-morning, ready to go into the garden." I bowed. "Yes, Master." Tomorrow. "Thank you, Master." This was Jevin. He had surely been shocked before, but now a slight smile was coming over him. "I will see the two of you tomorrow." My father met eyes with each of us, his face more serious than I'd ever seen. Now go finish the training I have assigned. I must go care for the garden." His silver robe swiveled around him as he turned down the dark walkway. Jevin and I turned as well, but didn't start walking. He was beaming now. "Can you believe it, Shay? I'll be allowed to enter the garden tomorrow. Your training paid off more than I could have guessed." I smiled, though it took more effort than I would have liked. "You did well, Jevin. You worked really hard." I let out a sigh. "We have a lot to learn for tomorrow, though. Let's go back to my room to study. I have the materials I need there." "Right," said Jevin. The rest of the day was non-stop. I didn't let it stop. I gave Jevin as much information as I could about the symbols of the garden, how to mix and apply the bright teal face paint, the significance of the stone where we placed our shoes, the importance of entering the garden with only bare feet, and the resonance you would feel in the garden if you kept your thoughts in the correct mindset. Jevin was more eager to learn today than ever before. I left him late. He was reading the handbook, nose deep, when we walked to his room. Though he was so serious about learning, he almost seemed to lift off the ground as he walked. I smiled softly as I left him, glad he was so excited. After returning to my room, I closed the door and stood with arms crossed. Though I'd known Jevin was older than I when I started my training and that his would be accelerated, I had to admit it was painful knowing he was going into the garden after merely 2 weeks. Opening the cupboard that held my full array, I ran a finger over the golden chest plate. I had done a good job. That was why Jevin was able to enter so soon. I should be happy. We would soon be able to share in the secrets of the garden even sooner now. I'd be able to discuss things about the garden that I would never speak of with my father. A soft breeze came from my open window. I walked to it, dropping my arms to look outside. There were the stars, more than I could ever count. I lost myself for a while in looking at them. They seemed to draw me in. They moved ever so slowly if you watched, and I realized the longer I looked, the more stars I could see. They appeared from what had surely been black a moment before. Things could get better. I just had to keep looking for better things. My chest felt looser and swelled as I drew in a breath of plant-perfumed wind. I wasn't hungry the next morning. My hand had been inches away from Jevin's door, but something stopped me from knocking. I wanted to be alone. The tunnel was dark when I entered, the lamps unlit as it was almost an hour too early, but I'd been unwilling to stay in my room. I plunged into the darkness of the walkway, staying in the middle so as not to run into either wall. Somehow, in the complete black, I felt almost weightless. My boots were silent on the soft soil. Though I hardly knew where to place my foot with each step, I noticed that I felt strangely comfortable. I'd been down this tunnel many times before, but in its darkness by myself, I didn't have to think about how other people saw me, or even how I saw myself. I felt safe walking through the unknown. I smiled as I came to the bar of sunlight lying across the ground, one end touching the east side of the tunnel, the other making its way to the west. My eyes fell onto the flat stone set by the wall. It had symbols carved smoothly into it. My version of the handbook hardly said anything of the stone, but that it was where we were to place our shoes. The carvings on the rock were similar to the symbols on our faces, but they were much more harmonious than our painted symbols, blending together seamlessly. As I gazed at the stone, I felt as though I were trying to remember something that could not be remembered. The markings seemed like they belonged to something else as well. I waited silently for my father and Jevin, straightening as lamps lit up one by one ahead of me. My father stopped, eyes wide when he saw me. "Shay Light?" I bowed. "Good morning, Master." He looked behind me. "Where is Jevin?" "He should be here soon." My father lit a final lamp, and we stood in silence. Not a minute later, the soft padding of boots reached our ears as Jevin came into view, his robe and face paint perfect. We said our hellos. Jevin smiled brightly to me, and I returned it as I saw how eager he truly was. I may have been wrong to feel uncomfortable about Jevin entering the garden today. After our shoes were removed, my father stepped ahead of us until he was standing just before the light. He took a deep breath. Jevin. In the back of my mind there echoed a Ch.9, the way my father had said it on my own first day in the garden. Jevin and I stood side by side, my robed shoulder touching the soft green fabric over his upper arm. Today you will enter the garden, my father continued, his low voice resonating within him. You will leave whatever life you saw for yourself and move forward in your knowledge to become the master keeper of the garden. The three of us were all perfectly still. You must understand the depth of this. From the moment you breach the light, your task is to protect the great tree. Of course, master, said Jevin, not missing a beat. We removed our shoes and the light slid over my father as he broke through it first. After taking a breath and settling into the mindset, I was next. I heard Jevin letting out a long breath behind me. I hoped he would fall into the mindset easily this morning. When he caught up to my side, we followed my father together to the antechamber of the garden. The colored light of the stained glass windows slanted through the gold gate. The key clicked as my father turned it in its lock. I heard Jevin's breath catch. Ch.9, my father spoke. Jevin needs to see the garden clearly the first time he enters it, so he will enter after me. I felt the slightest twinge near my heart, but I understood. Jevin winked as he sidled past me. He seemed so happy. I wanted him to have a clear view of the garden when he saw it. Jevin's dreadlocks tilted backward the slightest bit as we crossed into the garden, and he looked up at the stained glass ceiling. The light stained him brilliantly. I looked down at myself, watching the teals, purples, and golds slide over my robes and feet. As the light shifted, I felt the changes in color. My father moved out of the way as we reached the end of the tall hedges. Then Jevin was centered, in full view of the garden. A small noise of awe escaped him. Then I saw his shoulders droop. He moved to the side to let me through, locking eyes as I drew beside him. I nodded toward my father. He was in charge of Jevin's training now, and, especially with the Tree of the Fallen, he would be the one to explain. Master, began Jevin, the great tree, she is smaller than I would have thought. This is not the great tree, the master said, gazing forward. I realized he wasn't upset as he'd been when relaying the news to me. He was almost relaxed. The great tree was killed many years ago. Jevin turned to me once more. I held his eyes this time. Again, my father didn't seem ashamed as he told the rest of the story about the people whom had destroyed the great tree and her seeds. Jevin listened in earnest. My father allowed no time for Jevin to ask questions, but started taking him around the garden and showing him the different plants, explaining aspects of them. As Jevin crouched, absorbed while my father explained that this plant, Steps of Wrath, needed a specially made fertilizer, I realized I wouldn't be given further instruction. My duties were waiting to be done, and I determined I'd do a few my father might not have time for while training Jevin. I worked, feeling separate from the master and his new apprentice. When our day was over and our shoes were back on, my father turned to Jevin and I. You have done well with Jevin's initial training, Ch.9. Now, however, I will be taking over. I nodded. That much had been clear from the day's duties. but I felt a small swell of pride in my father telling me I'd done well. You won't need to be back in the garden for another 2 weeks, as usual. He then looked to Jevin. You, Jevin, I want in the garden every day. We must get started on all you have to learn as soon as possible. My insides deflated once more. I kept getting disappointed with how much Jevin was allowed to learn, but said nothing. Jevin needed this training. He would be the master gardener eventually. I would not. When Jevin and I left, there were many people in the hallways preparing to go to the evening meal. We got to my bedroom door, and because there were a few children shouting and running by, he said nothing, but his wide eyes and raised brows made it clear that he wanted to talk. For one streak of time, I considered pretending I hadn't understood. A wash of what might have been jealousy or inadequacy was starting to surge in the pit of my stomach. That wasn't Jevin's fault, though, and I instead held the door open slightly for him to walk into my room. There was another part of myself eager to talk about the Tree of the Fallen with my best friend. I thought the washroom might be the best place to speak. I doubted anyone would hear us there and we could wash off our face paint. As I seated myself next to the steaming pool, Jevin dropped down heavily next to me. The door was shut, and he spoke reverently. So, the great tree. I never expected that. I know. I had long wanted to share this burden with him. When I first saw it, I was so disheartened. I'd expected the tree to be as tall as the stained glass dome. It's hard to believe the great tree was destroyed. Truly. And now there's a new tree. The Tree of the Fallen, was it? I sighed. Yes, sometimes I wonder if it's right that we keep it a secret. My father says people would be afraid if they knew. As long as it protects them, I suppose there's no harm in it. Jevin nodded, solemn. I swirled my feet in the water as Jevin scooped some into his hands and leaned forward to remove his paint. Blue-green droplets trailed down his fingers, sending small clouds of color into the water below. I rolled up my sleeves to begin removing my own. Jevin grabbed at a drying cloth and patted his face. Is it all off? He asked, pulling his face from the cloth. I laughed. He still had faint teal streaks running down his cheeks. I took a handful of soap flakes, scooting closer to place them into his cupped hands. Here. Sometimes it's difficult to remove the paint because of the oils it contains. He took the soap and went back to scrubbing. What did you think of the garden? I was almost afraid to know. He held up a finger, soap in his eyes, then rinsed and dried his face once again. It was back to its original color now and glowed in the lamplight. Water slid down the sides of his face. The garden, he said. I thought it was wonderful. The pools almost seemed to glow, and there were so many plants I had never seen before. Good, I smiled. I just can't believe the great tree was destroyed, he said, sliding his eyes back to me. You really don't know who did it? No, I sighed and shook my head. I wonder who it could have been all the time. The great tree protects everyone, so who would have wanted to cut it down? It is strange. And the master gardener, it's amazing he was able to grow a new tree. It is. I have no idea what I would have done in that situation. Can you imagine? But he found a way. I ran my hands over the steaming water, warming them. The thing you're supposed to care for suddenly destroyed, not knowing how or why. Indeed. Jevin stared at the wall unseeingly. Hopefully we won't ever have to deal with something like that. I filled my hands with water, beginning to remove the paint from my face, grabbing soap flakes to finish, and rinsed. I felt the drying cloth touch my hands. Thank you. What are you going to do for the next 2 weeks while I'm in the garden? Jevin asked as if he wasn't too interested. I wonder if he realized I was feeling uncomfortable. I could have told the truth. I didn't know what I was going to do. I would try to train, try to do something. He was my only companion these days, though, so I would be by myself. Before any of this, I never would have minded. Tomorrow, though, Jevin would be in the garden, and I wouldn't. I would only ever be an apprentice now. Jevin would go and learn the things only meant for masters. Probably work on training. I haven't been able to train properly lately. I don't know why a smile crossed my face as I said it. I don't know why I pushed those feelings aside and I didn't tell him. But I did know he could do nothing to change any of it. That sounds like a good plan. He leaned back. We left soon after that, satisfied in sharing the secrets of the garden. So that was chapter 9. Hope you guys are enjoying the reading. Hope you're all doing well too. Bye.